So we have a lot to catch up on. Sit down. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we've got some catching up to do. It's been an extra long time since I filmed my last video. Well, technically, I did film a video at the end of March in preparation for April, but the footage was kind of long, and I went on a vacation with my family. I was not able to edit until like mid-April, and I figured it was late enough in the month. We would just wait and refilm. I would combine all of my March reads and all of my April reads. Now, that is a lot of books to keep track of, especially because I have been reading at a good clip, doing lots of audiobooks. Audiobooks do count as reading, if you want my opinion. And that means I have 31 books to share with you that I've read in the past 2 months, as well as a handful of other books I want to share that I am interested in reading, my potential TBR for the month of May, if you will. In order to kind of truncate this video so it's not 2 hours long, I don't think you want to watch that. I made some notes for myself. I organized my books in their monthly categories from least favorite to most favorite, and I took down just a couple notes so I can hopefully be really concise about these books and encourage you to read them if it sounds like something that you'd be interested in. And as always, make sure to subscribe if you like this type of content, or if you are interested in my yarn fiber related content too, because I share a lot of that here on this channel as well. Make sure to comment down below if you've read any of these books, and if you want to have a conversation with me about any of them. I would love to chat with you about all these things that I've been reading recently. All right, are we ready to do this quickly and concisely and let you know all the books I've read the past couple months? First, we're gonna start off with our March books. I read 18 books in March, which is a lot. I should have counted. Let me figure out how many of them were on audio. Okay, 11 of those books were on audio. Uh-oh, I miscounted. I have 12? I miscounted. 12 books on audio. I read 2 books electronically, and then the other, is it 3 books? I read physical copies of. The other 4 books I should have written this down. I'm so sorry. So that's a good spread, and that's pretty on par with my reading that I do. I tend to do a lot of audiobooks with my driving for work, listening while I'm exercising or doing chores or whatnot, but I do have some ebooks and some physical books as well. Starting at the beginning, my least favorite book of March was actually a short story called The House of the Fall of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, it is an old short story. He is the founder of horror, and I am not as much of a fan of classic horror compared to modern day horror. I don't get spooked as much when I read older horror. And I think a lot of that has to do with different nuances in the language and the atmosphere that I am not privy to from my modern day perspective. So I think the more I learn about the historical horror, the more I can get out of it. But I read this short story twice as kind of a prelude to reading T. Kingfisher's What Moves the Dead, because I'm really interested in reading that series. And it's a retelling of Poe's short story, which I'm really excited to get to. Hopefully I can get to that soon. But that's why I read this. I'd not read it before. It was a little creepy. I definitely got more out of it the second time I listened through it, but it's just not my favorite. I prefer modern horror more. I rated The Fall of the House of Usher 3.5 star. Solid read, but nothing exciting. The next book that I read was a physical copy, and this is Done and Dusted by Lila Sage. This is a cowboy rancher type of romance. The girl, Emmy, comes back home. She's a barrel racer, which I had to look up. I had no idea what that was. So that was kind of fun to go on a little tangent on the internet to learn about that. Emmy comes home. She had an accident, and she's considering leaving behind her barrel racing, even though she's been really good at it. And so she's just kind of come home because that's her safe space, but she's not really sure what to do next step in her life, especially because she always wanted to go away from home in growing up. She reconnects with her brother's best friend. This is Brooks, Luke, and he is stereotypically the bad boy. She doesn't have a great opinion of him because he's kind of the troublemaker of the group, but she gets to know him a little better. This romance was solid. I do really like the cowboy rancher style romance is what I learned from reading this, but this book in particular was fun. It was kind of shallow. It was spicy. I did not really like the bedroom talk between these two, and the dynamic of the relationship in the spicy scenes compared to the dynamic of the relationship in like the real world outside of the bedroom was just so different, and that kind of threw me off a little bit, which I didn't like as much. I really liked these two characters and how there were hints at their own like personal trauma and personal struggles that they face. But I wish it would have gone a little bit deeper and had a little bit more meat to that part of the story, because I felt like those portions of the characters were really real and raw, and I wanted more of that. I decided to give this a 3.75 star. There was just a lot more that I felt like could have made this a really, really good romance, and instead it was just a solid read. If you're looking for a wholesome story with some spice and happy ending where everything gets tied up nice and neatly, then this is a good cowboy romance for you. The next book I read was on audio, and this is The Center by, let me get this name right, Ayesha, Manazir, Siddiqi. And this I also rated a 3.75 star. It did not live up to my expectations in a lot of ways, so it was not a bad book at all. I still enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I read it. The main character is the narrator of this book, and it's a very familiar, almost intimate narration, which is an intriguing thing. But since I kind of didn't like the main character, I didn't really appreciate the narration. I felt like if I liked the main character more, then I would have liked the narration style a lot more, because it would have contributed to my liking of the character. The main character has goals to be a translator, but she feels like she can't go as far as she wants. She's not taken seriously in her translation work. She meets a boyfriend who is fluent in so many languages. He's white, he's privileged, she does not know how he does it. He reveals that he goes to the center and takes these rigorous courses to become fluent in languages, and she decides to partake. And you kind of find out about her journey through the center and what's really going on there. I feel like this book was much more of a literary fiction with some horror elements sprinkled on top than a horror novel, and I just felt like I wish there was more horror. There wasn't a lot of suspense, even though there were lots of hints that there was something mysterious going on, but I didn't feel that suspense or that building up of the plot. When the final reveal happened, it wasn't surprising, it didn't catch me off guard, it wasn't horrific, it was just kind of meh. So I feel like the horror elements sprinkled in, I could barely taste them. And so it fell short in a lot of ways, but I really appreciated the discussions on literacy. There were also some discussions on racism and classism, though the main character's hypocrisy kind of, I don't know if that was intentional to add to the discussion or if for me it retracted from the discussion. And I also liked the conversations about translation work. It was very interesting. I think if you are not a horror person, but you enjoy literary fiction and you want to dip your toes in horror, this might be a good place to start. But for me, as someone who does enjoy horror, I feel like this did not deliver that for me. The next book that I read was also an audiobook, and I read The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. This is a YA mystery novel. The main character, Avery, she's impoverished, she's struggling in her life. She is in high school and just trying to get to a safer spot financially and provide for her half-sister and herself. And she comes to find out that she has been made the sole inheritor of this massive, like, $1 billion estate and all these assets as long as she lives at the main mansion for a year. Now, this billionaire character, Tobias Hawthorne, he is known for not playing tricks, but like making up games, having riddles, things like that. And so all the grandsons who thought that they would be inheriting more are trying to figure out how Avery plays into these games. And they think that she's a riddle to be figured out. This is the first of a trilogy, and there's another like spin-off series that has recently started as well. I enjoyed this. I rated it a 3.75. I thought that the mystery was intriguing, as well as the riddles and stuff that was interesting to follow along with. However, I did not like that there's like this love triangle between these two emotionally unavailable brothers and the girl, Avery. Like, I just did not feel any connection. It just felt very insta-lovey. There was not really a chemistry there other than there's a girl, there's some boys, they all live in the same house kind of chemistry. I just like was not behind it, and it detracted from the story for me. But I was intrigued by the story, even if I saw the plot twist coming from a mile away. I think if you were more of a YA reader, you might not have seen it coming, but I saw it coming. And I'm intrigued to see where the rest of the series goes, but I don't know at this point if I'm gonna buy the rest of the books. I did buy this one. I don't know if I want to buy the rest of the series. The next book I read, I don't have a copy of. This is How to Keep House While Drowning by Casey Davis. And she's got a background in, I think, psychology, if I remember correctly. And she also has ADHD. And she specifically wrote this very short nonfiction book directed towards those who are neurodivergent so that they can be successful in consuming this media. So that was really interesting. It was short. There was a lot of like summaries at the end of chapters, and in the audiobook specifically, it would say, if you're listening to the abridged version, skip ahead to this chapter, so that those who only really want the meat of what the little book contained could just skip between chapters and only listen to maybe like a third or a half of the book, which it was already like a 4-hour listen, so it was pretty short for me to listen to. I listened in one afternoon. This book doesn't give you a lot of strategies necessarily for like addressing clutter, but it does a lot to help you shape your mindset around clutter and organizing and chores around your house. They relabel them as care tasks, so you can focus on what is going to help me now versus what's going to help me in the future, and you make the choice. Is it more kind to yourself to rest this evening, or is it more kind to yourself to pack your lunch for work tomorrow? So I really like that reframing. I recommended this book to my husband, who is neurodivergent. I don't think he's read it yet, but I think that this is a good little resource and it's a nice quick read. 4 stars, I recommend. Another really quick read, I only included this because I actually purchased the book from Barnes & Noble, and this is All My Friends Are Dead by Avery, Monsen, and Jory John. This book is morbid, it's really funny, and I read it in an Eeyore voice. It just made me laugh the whole time. It's nice and short. There's a lot of pictures and not a lot of words. And it was just funny and a little bit macabre. And it was just funny and a bit morbid. My daughter's also asked me to read this to her multiple times because she sees the dinosaur out front and she just does not understand what's happening. This would be a great white elephant gift. 4 stars. It was funny. It was short. There was nothing super like meaningful about it, but it was a book unlike any other I've ever read. My next audiobook that I listened to was Belittled Women by Amanda Sellet, and this is a YA novel. I guess it's a YA romance. I was blown away by this book. This was really fun. I also rated this a 4 star. If you like Little Women, I think you would really enjoy this book because it is not a traditional retelling. The main characters of the story are 3 daughters and their mother who have a Little Women style like house exhibit museum performance type thing where school groups and tourists will come in and like watch them reenact scenes from Little Women. And the main character, Jo, she's the oldest, she feels like she's been forced into this life. She really doesn't want to do this. She wants to focus on her own goals, like going away to college, being on the track team, things like that. And her mom is just kind of like pigeonholed her into like a certain role. So she's trying to come to her own and navigating a love triangle in the midst of it with characters that are definitely reminiscent of Bear and of Lori. And so it's kind of fun to follow along and notice little snippets of overt and covert different mentions of Little Women. So that was really fun when I was reading this. Also, the banter is hilarious, super funny. I really love listening to Jo and her interactions. This book felt a little bit ridiculous, but it was a really fun read and definitely one that I recommend. The only big downfall that I feel like is that this book wasn't serious at all. It could have gone into a lot more depth with some of these angsty feelings that Jo had and some of the conflict within her family. That would have made this book next level. And also I felt like even though the banter and the dialogue was really good, this book didn't have any description or like background information. It was mostly dialogue, which was really good dialogue. If that was the case, I kind of wish that this book had been formatted more like a play rather than a novel, if that makes sense. And I feel like that could have added to the book as well, since they do a lot of acting out scenes in the book. The next book I read, I actually have a vlog on my channel. This is Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers, and this was Wilbury Fiber Co.'s book box book for spring. And so I finally got a chance to read this in March. And make sure to check out my vlog here where I share the yarn, the book, my experience of working with the yarn and reading the book in that vlog. So make sure to check that out. I enjoyed this book. Solid 4-star. This is quirky, it's fun, it's a quick read. Technically it's a murder mystery, but the mystery is like just like a little smidgen of the story. There's really not any clues. There's not really any detective work. I saw the conclusion coming from a mile away. And so the mystery was definitely lacking for me. I was hoping for more of a mystery. This is very, very cozy mystery. So there's not a lot of substance to the mystery. But there's a lot of found family of these characters getting to know each other as Vera's trying to figure out which of them committed the murder of this honestly not a good guy. It's heartwarming to see these characters come together and for them to overcome some of their weaknesses that have become apparent with the way that Marshall, the dead guy, treated them in their life. And I especially liked, I think her name was Julie, the widow of the guy who died, and she's got a little 2-year-old daughter. I felt like some of these characters were really, really shallow. And some of these characters I actually did like, and I felt like they were distinct and had some personality, and some of them not so much. So there was a little bit of imbalance there. But if you're looking for a wholesome read, definitely touched my heart, pulled at my heartstrings, made me cry a little bit, with like a little sprinkle of mystery, I think you would like this book. The next book I read was an ebook because I could not find the audiobook. It is The Love That Split the World by Emily Henry. This was her debut novel. It is a YA romance. It's like a paranormal romance. It was very interesting. Not like anything I had anticipated. And it sounds like she's got another book, 1 Million Junes maybe, that is also kind of a paranormal YA romance style of book. I also rated this book 4 stars. I was very intrigued by it. I really appreciate what it was doing. I think I enjoyed reading it, but I also don't know if I liked it. It was a very interesting experience. I love Emily Henry's writing, and I feel like these characters were really distinct and had flaws and were very real, though they were definitely messy. This main character is a Native American who has been adopted into a white family from a very young age, so she has a hard time finding her identity, kind of being split between these worlds. And she meets Beau and starts to get to know him and realizes that sometimes she can't find him. Sometimes she sees things that are not quite real, like a little off from reality, and so she's wondering, like, is she seeing another world? Like, what is going on? So that's kind of where the paranormal comes in. So you see their relationship grow. It was very much based on circumstance and like them sharing the same kinds of experience and being in the same places as each other, but the chemistry was really good. And so even though I didn't understand why they got together, I felt very committed to them as a couple, if that makes sense. There's a little bit of like time bendiness. There's definitely a lot of mystery and like what is actually happening, and she's trying to figure it out. She's even seeing a specialist about it. She's trying to figure out what's happening. There's a lot of mystery. It's also kind of emotional and heavy. I had this as my read a chapter or two before bed book for a while, but I had to stop because it just gave me some really weird dreams. So if you're okay reading something that's emotional, it didn't like end sadly necessarily, but I had lots of feelings, like lots of visceral reactions for myself as I was reading it. So I had a lot of intense feelings. So be warned. But it was a good read and it was very intriguing and very different than what she has written more recently. Moving on to something lighter, I finished this physical copy of Make a Scene by Mimi Grace. I haven't found this book anywhere but on Amazon. I think it might have been published just by herself. So I definitely recommend supporting indie authors like this. It's a nice short romance. Retta Majors is a baker and she's opened this bakery. She's successful, but her cousin is now engaged to Retta's ex-boyfriend. So it's this big family drama. She's trying to be the adult out of everyone and still like supporting her cousin, even though she's still really hurt by it. And then everyone in her family is like making a big deal out of it. She just wants it all to blow over. She meets local gym owner from next door and they decide to fake date in order for her to kind of show, I've moved on, I'm okay, let's all move on from the drama of this. And it's just a nice, quick, fun read. A lot of the characters very much seem over the top and kind of like caricatures of like real people, which is really fun to read. I feel like there is some depth that could be added. I really wish that there was more depth. I rated this a 4.25 star. If it had more depth in the characters, I feel like more length would have added to this book to allow for that depth of the characters and for you to really get to know the characters a little bit better and see the relationship blossom. I love the chemistry between these two though, and it also felt very real in like how awkward they were, but not 100% awkward, just like couple awkward lines here and there. It just felt very real, but they also definitely like connected with one another. It was very sweet, very fun, very quick read. This was my Valentine's Day read that I started on Valentine's, and so I finished it early March. The next book that I have is The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J. Maas, and I rated this a 4.25 star. This is technically a YA fantasy, though it's more like a new adult fantasy because the characters are in their late teens, early 20s type of realm. This is actually the prequel to the Throne of Glass series, and I read this third. You can read it kind of anytime. I don't know. I feel like if I had read this first, I wouldn't have cared about who Celaena was. There are 5 novellas in here about Celaena's life before the Throne of Glass book, and you hear about all these experiences in little snippets throughout even the first book or two of the Throne of Glass series. So a lot of this isn't new information. Even like the big climax of this novella grouping, I already knew what was going to happen, which made it a little hard to read because I didn't want to find out more details of like these horrible things. But I kind of feel like if I'd read this first, then I would have been more intrigued about like the climax, and it would have been more of a surprise to me rather than something I knew that was coming. I wouldn't have cared as much about Celaena and like why I would be reading these. So not my favorite. I feel like it's not necessary to understand what is happening in the rest of the series, but it was fun to spend more time with Celaena and see more of her background story and just learn a little bit more about her, add a little bit more context to who she was, even though I feel like you don't need this to understand her as a character from the beginning. The next book I read was an ebook, and this is King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book in the King of Scars duology, which are the final 2 books in the Grishaverse series. I guess there's like the Shadow and Bone trilogy and the Six of Crows duology, and now the King of Scars duology. But I read Rule of Wolves, which is the second book in the duology, in the month of April, and there is definitely a possibility for more books after this. This book is focused on King Nikolai, and it takes place about a year or so after the Six of Crows duology takes place. It has multiple POVs, just like the other books in the Grishaverse, though there were a couple POVs that, like, one of them I didn't enjoy reading as much because it was very foreboding. I knew something bad was going to happen, and I was right. And another one, a really big perspective actually, felt kind of unnecessary. Like, I didn't see how it connected with the main plots of the book as a whole. It felt very separate from the rest of the book, and so I wish it would have connected a little bit better. So not my favorite, but I rated it a 4.5 star. I really like these characters. I like being back in this world, but a little bit of the story was just like not connecting for me. Man, the cliffhanger at the end of this totally caught me off guard. And just like the other books in the Grishaverse, it's a YA fantasy. This next book was one I read on audio, and then I made sure to purchase a copy myself because I loved it. This is Monstrilio by Gerardo, Sámano, Córdova, and this is a debut novel actually. It's a horror novel, and I really enjoyed it. I rated this a 4.75 star. The beginning of this book, I am like astounded. The horror, it just like was almost too much. The mother, Magos, is devastated because her 11-year-old son has died and he had been sick his whole life. She takes a piece of his lung and keeps it. And then she starts feeding it and like encouraging it to grow, and then it starts to grow. You find all that out on the back of the cover. Mind-boggling. And I was honestly so horrified by the beginning of this book. But then I was also horrified because I came to like Monstrilio, and I thought he was cute, and I thought he was misunderstood. So it definitely pulled on my heartstrings. You see him grow up, and you're like, why is no one killing this thing that should not be sentient? And yet you like him too. And so it was a very interesting experience reading this book and feeling like I was getting sucked in and understanding more of why the characters weren't harming him and like trying to help him grow to be like a contributing member of society. So you see him even as like a young adult, and how he doesn't quite feel normal because he's not quite human either. He's still Monstrilio at heart. There was definitely some horror elements throughout the book and at the end. The only thing is I really wish there was a little bit more of a climax in the horror at the end of this book. That would have made it perfect. But otherwise, I loved it. It was surprisingly heartfelt and sentimental while still being very horrific, and gave me a lot to think about. It had a lot of Frankenstein vibes. So if you like that idea of questioning what it means to be human and what our role is in making something human, it was a fascinating read and definitely one that I can see myself reading again. The next book I want to talk about, my last 4.75 star of March. I had a lot of good reads in March. This is Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. This is the second book in the Throne of Glass series. In this book, Selena has already won her position as the King's Champion, and now she's going about doing his bidding and trying to figure out what is actually going on and how is she going to kind of escape this bargain she's made with the king so that she can be free and live according to her conscience without supporting the king. So she's trying to grapple with that. The ending of this book, I'm gobsmacked. I did not see it coming. There was a huge reveal at the end, like in the last like page or two, that like totally blew me away. And so I had to start the next book ASAP. I really liked this book and how the pacing just kept growing and growing throughout, so you just kept consuming faster and faster. You could not stop reading this book. I did it on an audiobook because I really like the narrator. And the only problem was I did not like the drama between Selena and Kale. It was not my favorite, that like tension or whatever. But other than that, I loved this book. So let's move right into Heir of Fire, which is the third book. I read this fourth because I read Assassin's Blade between Crown of Midnight and Heir of Fire. 5 star. Adore this book. I love this book. Selena is coming into her own. She is now free from the king in a way, and she has come to her own, building her legacy, coming to her own power. And so it's really cool to see this transformation happen with her as she's like trying to come to terms with like who she is now, what she's been through, and what she envisions for the future. There's a gorgeous Fae prince that comes into play, and there's an inkling that that'll probably be a love interest in the future, but it's not in this book. There's a lot of lore in this book. This is a really pivotal book in the series so far, and I really enjoyed it. You also learn a lot about what's happening back at the castle, at the Throne of Glass. Did Dorian dirty is all I'm gonna say. The next book I want to talk about, I'm trying really hard to get through these. I just want to talk about books so much. This is gonna be a longer video. I'm so sorry, even if I'm trying. This is Exit Strategy by Martha Wells, and this is the fourth book. Yes, the fourth book in the Murderbot series. So the fourth novella. The next book after this is more of a full-length novel, which I'm excited to get to eventually. And in this book, you see a lot of sentiment and almost like emotion and meaning behind Murderbot's actions. So Murderbot is becoming more and more human-like in their interactions and like their motivations for things. This is a sci-fi. You see Murderbot come to the rescue for some of the humans that they had interacted with in the past, and so that's fun to like return to characters that you probably loved before. I just love Murderbot so much. It's a cozy sci-fi, nice and short, about a security bot. They're a construct. They've got organic parts and mechanical parts, and as you realize they've got social anxiety, and there's a lot more humanness to them than meets the eye, and I love that. 5 star. Almost done with my March books. 18 is a lot to get through. The next book, 5 star read, is The Adventures of al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty. Trying with the name. This is a little bit of a hefty book. I did the audiobook for this, and it was amazing, honestly. But this book, historical fantasy about pirates. What more can I say? It was everything you could want in a historical fantasy about pirates. There was definitely some interesting magic and lore behind this. The main character is a middle-aged woman who's a retired pirate, and she's brought back into the world of piracy for like one last quest to kind of help set her family up financially, because they've just kind of been skirting on the edges of poverty. And so it's really relatable to hear how she talks about not being as fit as she used to and having aches and pains, and priorities are different than they were 15 years ago when she was on the seven seas. It takes place in maybe like 12th century Middle East. So there was a lot of really interesting like historical elements in here from a historical time period and place that I'm not super familiar with. So that was really interesting to read about. The fantasy was building throughout the whole book. It was just lovely. I loved it. It was really hilarious, and especially with the audiobook, the main character is like telling their story, but there's a scribe writing it down. And so sometimes the narrator is like arguing with the scribe, and it's actually in the book like that, but it just came to life through the narration, and they did a really good job. My final and favorite book from March that I read was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. This was also an audiobook, and Meryl Streep narrates it. It was so good. This book is very much feels like day in the life style. There's not like a huge climax. There's a few different like turning points and plot twists within this story, but basically the main character is stuck at home on their cherry farm. Their three daughters have come back home because it is COVID time in early 2020, in like spring, summer of 2020. And so everyone is at home and they're spending a lot of time together. There's a lot of focus on family, and there's a nostalgia. There's a good summer vibe. So this is a great summer book. I totally recommend. Is recounting her past to her daughters. Her daughters want to know about the movie star that she dated when she was doing theater as a young adult at Tom Lake. And so she goes through her history of being Emily in Our Town, and that being like her signature role in a few different plays, acting in one movie with a role that was very similar to Emily, and finishing off her career at Tom Lake as the character Emily. This was such a special book. I felt like I was there in the cherry orchards picking cherries and listening to my mom tell this story and reminisce. It was very nostalgic, very warm, very comforting. It was very romantic in the sense that as this mother is looking back on her life, she does mention some hard things, but she has greater perspective now, and she wouldn't change the life that she has for the life that she could have had, looking back on everything that she had been through. And so it's a very romantic view of the trials and hardships and experiences that she went through. So it definitely goes back and forth between modern day and actually telling the story of her past. Yeah, I just felt like I was another daughter picking cherries in the orchard with them. This book made me want to have more children so that I could have that kind of relationship with my children. That book made me want to move to Michigan and work on a cherry farm. It made me want to get back into community theater. It made me want to do so many things. It was inspiring, it was warm, it was nostalgic. I feel like I could have listened to this book forever. Like, I didn't want it to end. I just enjoyed being in this world. Oh man, okay, gotta stretch. That's all the books that I read in March. Time to look at my books for April, which I don't have as many, though I still have quite a few. Okay, so for April, let's see, I read 13 books. How many of them were audio? In April, I read 10 books on audio. I read 2 books physically, and I had 1 ebook that I finished in the month. My least favorite book for April was A Study in Drowning by Avery. I rated this a 3.25 star. I had high hopes for this book, and it was beautifully written, but I honestly found the main character so annoying. In some ways, this character seemed traumatized and was shy and submissive, and in other ways, this character seemed really immature and was really brash and rude and nonsensical in a lot of ways. She just kept penduluming back and forth, and so I could never get behind her. Like, I was so annoyed by every choice she made. I did not like this main character. This is a YA fantasy, and in this world, women are not allowed to study literature or even really write books because of their tiny brains. I don't know. The writing was beautiful in this book, but I could not get behind the world building. It just felt like, what a random thing to have engendered literature. It just didn't I feel like in a lot of other like dystopian or books with like misogyny as a big theme, it had other directions to go that like were more overarching than like literature, like a degree in literature. It felt a little like not a complete thought in like what the author was trying to do in like inserting misogyny in this fantasy world, if that makes sense. But anyway, the main character cannot study literature, even though she's super smart, did great on her tests, and she could theoretically pick any major she wanted except for literature because it's not open to women. So she picks architecture and she's a poor fit for it. She's really failing her classes. She's got some trauma related to like sexual harassment within this college, and so she accepts an offer to go to her late favorite author's manor house and to architecturally redesign it and give it new life. So she takes a break from school to go do this project. She meets another student who is learning about this author's life and trying to figure out some questions that he has about the truth of this author. This book is all vibes and does the plot very poorly, which is why I rated it so low. It was really intriguing to read. It was beautiful to listen to. It had a lot of really interesting points, but it never followed through on any of them. And I feel like a lot of the actual mythology or like lore behind the fantasy of this world was very uncertain. Like, is it real? Is it not? Is she crazy for seeing the Fairy King? Or is she not crazy? What's actually going on? And it wasn't very satisfying to read in conclusion because of all these like back and forth thoughts that you have throughout the whole book. And then you get info dumped at the very end on like what's been happening to kind of tie up all these plot holes that you've seen coming from a mile away. It just wasn't very satisfying of a read compared to what it could have been. I know lots of people love this book, but it was not for me. I feel like the plot and the characters were lacking very much. That was a big rant. I'm so sorry. The next book that I read was an audiobook as well. This was Swift and Saddled by Lila Sage. I was intrigued by the first book I read in this series and I wanted to continue on, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to buy the copy. And I'm glad I didn't because I hated the female main character again. First of all, I adore Wes as a character. I adore Rebel Blue Ranch and his work with Baby Blue. I really liked the background for Ada's character and her reason for coming to help out with Baby Blue and like redesigning this guest home that they were gonna have on the ranch. But she annoyed me so much. I feel like she honestly had no personality besides her internalized trauma and self-doubt that she had. And while there were a couple moments within the book that she was thinking something and I was like, actually, yeah, I can relate to that. Like having issues socially, making friends, whatnot. Most of the time, she just seemed in her head way too much and ridiculous, and I just could not get over her. She was not in a place to have a healthy relationship, and there were numerous instances where she was purposefully cruel, purposefully lying, running away, doing things that are like very childish and immature. And granted, her first marriage went very poorly, so she's got some trauma, but she wasn't even like working through it. She just was like running away from her problems. She was not dealing with her trauma in a healthy way, and that impacted her relationship with the main character. So I was not behind them as a couple at all because she was not anywhere near having a healthy relationship. She needed to work on herself a lot. Though I did feel like they had good chemistry with one another. So I just feel like I wish her character development had been a little further along than it was in the story. And comparing this to the first book in the series, the bedroom talk didn't cringe me out as much. So that's a plus. I rated this a 3.5 stars. So overall, I didn't like it quite as much as the previous book because Ada made me really want to throw the book a lot. The next book on my list, 3.75 star, is another romance by B.K. Borrison. This is In the Weeds. This is the second book in the Love Light Farms series, and this takes place in the springtime. This is the spring book. So Evelyn and Beckett kind of had a one-night stand turned into like a weekend stand, and they reminisce on that experience in this book. They run into each other at Love Light Farms in the first book and realize who they're seeing, and it's really awkward in the first book. It's hilarious. But this book goes through not only their first not only their first few encounters that weekend, but also a little bit of the awkwardness of her doing a social media feature on Love Life Farms after she had like left before he could say goodbye from their little weekend together where they met. And then she decides that she needs a break from social media. She needs to disconnect and go to the place where she can find her happy. And she decides that Love Light Farms, this little small town in Inglewild, I can't remember what the town is called, that is the place where she can go to kind of disconnect from the world. She, of course, runs into him again. I really love these characters, and I love their own personal struggles, their imperfections. I really, really enjoyed it. Oh, and I love the small town feel of this book. I love this atmosphere. However, this book was so lusty. I feel like they were obsessed with each other, but only in like a physical sense, and they could not stop thinking about each other because of this weekend that they had where all they did was bedroom stuff. It lasted like 50 or 60 pages before I feel like anything really happened in the story, because they just kept like having daydreams about each other, but they don't have any like actual emotional connection to each other. They're just thinking about each other's bodies. And I just like was not on board for that. I didn't really enjoy that. So this took me a very long time to read. I finally got the audiobook, and I blew through the end of the audiobook in like 2 days because the beginning was just so hard for me to read, because I would just read barely anything and want to put it down again because I was sick of hearing them think about each other's bodies. I'm very much more of like an emotional relationship person, and so having the physical chemistry is great, but not nearly as important in the romances that I read. I also feel like there's some miscommunication. The like third act conflict was pretty stupid. Honestly, I really hated it. I hated how people were giving advice to them, really great, amazing advice, and then they would just like throw that advice to the wind and ignore it and do the complete opposite when they saw the person that they fell in love with, and they would totally mess things up even more. So it was very frustrating the last like 50 pages of this book, honestly. So there were lots of things I really loved and some things I really didn't love about this romance, but I'm definitely looking forward to reading the next book and seeing how it goes, because I feel like there's a lot of things I like about B.K. Borrison's writing, but they're also not perfect romances for me. I'm holding out that maybe the next one or the last one in the series, which is coming out later this year, will be like the perfect romance by this author for me. The next book I read was also an audiobook. There is a trend. I read Vengeance of the Pirate Queen, and this is the third book in the like Daughter of a Pirate King series. This is by Tricia Levenseller, and I rated this book 4 stars. I really like learning more about Serinda and Kieran and them as characters. This was fun to see them off on their own adventure. I really liked Serinda's character, and I liked her background. I enjoyed learning about her trauma and what made her the person that she is. I loved hearing about how she struggled becoming a captain for her ship and how that was a different role than she had taken on before, and it stretched her in a lot of ways. So I really loved all that. This is a fantasy pirate story. The fantasy elements and the fantasy plot were really interesting and kept me hooked and were very different than anything else I've read. And so that was really enjoyable. I just feel like Serinda and Kieran's relationship, I didn't like how it evolved. It just feels like it kind of happened very suddenly. I didn't like the pacing of the relationship. It felt very rushed to me. Maybe I could rate it higher than 4 stars. I did in general enjoy it. It is a YA, and so YA tends to be not my favorite style of writing. I feel like I like the new adult stuff, and this is kind of, the characters are new adult, but it feels a little bit on the younger side of the writing, just like a smidgen. But I really like Tricia Levenseller's books. I've enjoyed what I've read, and I hope to read more by her. Another audiobook. I was on a roll. Basically, this just means that all my ebooks and my physical books were taking me a longer time to read, and so I got through audiobooks faster than I could get through my physical or ebooks. The next book I read was Vampires of El Norte by Isabel Cañas, and this is a historical romance horror novel that my mom actually recommended to me. I rated it a 4.25 star. It was very well written. It was very intriguing reading about this history of, like, they called them the Texians instead of the Texans. The Americans fighting with Mexico. There's a war going on. When was the Mexican-American War? 1800s? I should know this. I'm so sorry. History has flown out of my brain since high school. But it's like Mexican-American war times, and there are these rancheros, ranchers, and cowboys, vaqueros. The main character girl, Nena, is the daughter of the big honcho ranch owner, ranchero, and one of the vaqueros is Nestor, and they have a really close relationship when they're younger, and then there's an attack, some kind of creature. It's a vampire, but not a vampire like you've heard of in like Dracula and stuff. It's very different. It's like a wild animal attacks her. He thinks she's dead, so he runs away from his guilt, lives on his own. She survived and she thinks he ran away, and there's like a lot of strife in the relationship. Fast forward like 9 or 10 years and they meet again. He's like, "What? You're alive?" And she's like, "How dare you come back here when you ran away?" And they both go off to war. She as a healer, he to fight for the rancheros' rights so that the Texans will not take over their land and claim it as their own. This book was very much more of a historical romance than a horror. I wanted more horror because the horror, like the descriptions of the vampires and seeing them like biting people and like sucking them dry, was amazing. It was perfect. But there was just not a lot of it. There were like little spaces of it, and a lot of the bulk of the story was Nena and Nestor and their relationship and figuring things out. You could tell that neither of them had had like a serious relationship before because they had a lot of ironing out to do, and there were some petty things that they did or said. I did really like their characters, and I like them together, and I like their chemistry, though I felt like Nena tried so hard to like have the best of both worlds without like committing to one side or the other, and it was just kind of frustrating. I was like, come on! She picked a side in the end, and it all worked out how I thought it would anyway. Yeah, it was a good book. I'm just reading some frustrating romances, I guess, recently. One that also has a little bit of frustration is Love and Other Flight Delays by Denise Williams. And this is a set of 3 novellas that take place at an airport or coinciding with airports and flights. I brought this on my trip to New York that I went on at the beginning of April. I wanted to read this on the airplane, and so that's what I did. I read 1 novella each on 3 different flights. We had 2 flights there, 2 flights back. And so it was perfect, honestly, for our traveling. So these 3 novellas, The Love Connection, The Misconnection, and The Sweetest Connection. My favorite was probably The Love Connection, the first one. There's an airport pet groomer that has been eyeing this man that she sees go through the airport often, like weekly, and they run into each other, and there's some chemistry there, and they get to know each other. It says there's fake dating. I do not remember fake dating. So it's fun to see their chemistry grow as they're coming close to one another. The Misconnection, I think, would do the best as a full-length novel because I enjoyed the premise of these academic rivals to lovers, and the dynamic of these 2 characters was so different, and so it's really interesting seeing them interact. But I feel like they needed more time to grow in their relationship with one another and for us to come to understand why they are so different, and for us to kind of warm a little bit more to the main male character who is a bit of a grumpy. And then the last story is 2 best friends who really need to end up together, but they're just like really stubborn and will not risk their friendship for a relationship. And so it was a really good story, and I really liked their chemistry, but it just was like, just get together already. But I honestly really enjoyed these novellas. Overall, I rated it a 4.25 star. I definitely recommend. It was perfect for reading on the airplane or reading if you're traveling, just thinking about how romantic airports can actually be. The next book I read was another audiobook. This is Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This is the next book after Ninth House, and it's a dark academia fantasy novel that takes place at Yale with their secret societies that actually have magic associated with them. And Alex Stern's the main character, and her position is one where she tries to protect all these secret societies from making permanent damage with their magic, whether it goes right or wrong. So she just kind of like polices them and makes sure they stay safe. She can see ghosts that you find out in the first book. And in this book, this is the sequel, she is trying to find Darlington, who has been captured by a demon and is now stuck in hell. So that's the premise of this book, trying to rescue him. So this book kind of takes a detour from the first book, which is very much focused on the secret societies and on Yale and dark academia vibes. And this one is focus more on like the supernatural and demons and things like that. So it's definitely taking the series in a different direction than the first book, which I think is unfortunate because I really love the first book. This book, I rated it a 4.25 star as well. I did enjoy it, but I don't really enjoy this direction as much as the Dark Academia, Secret Society stuff. There were lots of twists and turns where I really didn't know what was going to happen, or the pacing was a little bit off too in this book, so not my favorite, but it was still a really good book, and I'm looking forward to reading another one whenever it comes out. The next audiobook that I read was Natural Beauty, and this one is by Ling Huang. And this horror novel focuses on beauty and the cosmetic industry and what it means to be beautiful, European standards of beauty, privilege being afforded to the privileged, all sorts of really interesting themes. I rated this book a 4.25 star. It gave me a lot to think about, though I feel like there was way more going on with the plot, and I just didn't get as much resolution in all these different plot points and ideas of discussion that I was hoping for. It didn't tie these ideas together very well, and I feel like this book was over-sexualized, so I really didn't enjoy reading that. The main character had a very clinical perspective, so I didn't really enjoy reading. Like, the sexualized stuff felt like out of place, and her relationship with this job working for a beauty store called Holistic, using these interesting products. It just felt like, why is she here? Why is she doing that? She complains about her relationship with her parents, but it's like, why don't you fix your relationship with your parents? So I could not really get behind the main character. Like, I really did not understand her, honestly. But she notices changes happening to herself and to others because of these beauty products, and she just goes along with it. She was like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal. I gained 6 inches in a night. So I just did not understand the main character. I could not get behind her. It was a very interesting book on beauty and the horrors behind the beauty industry. There is a lot of body horror in this book. So it's definitely a horror novel compared to some of these others I mentioned that had sprinkles of horror in it. Gave me lots to think about, but didn't quite complete the thoughts. All right, this is my ebook that I read this month. This was Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo. Again, the second book in the King of Scars duology. This book I didn't like as much as previous one. I rated it a 4.25 star, so I still enjoyed it a lot. This definitely felt like a culmination of all the other books in the Grishaverse. There were character appearances and even villain appearances and things alluded to from other books in the series. So this was definitely a culmination, and I really enjoyed that. I just feel like throughout the book, I just lost my connection with Nikolai, and that's why I wanted to read these books. I absolutely loved Nikolai in the Shadow and Bones trilogy, and so I was a little disappointed with the path of Nikolai's growth throughout this book. I just felt like I felt distanced from him. That's not what I was looking for. It felt like there were a lot of moving parts going through this, and so at times it almost felt a little convoluted. There was just like a little bit too much going on and trying to be a culmination of the rest of the Grishaverse. There were lots of twists and turns, which was enjoyable. Also, multiple POVs. There were some big battles, which was exciting as things were finishing off. It definitely left room for future books in the Grishaverse, potentially. So we'll see if Leigh Bardugo writes those. If she does, I will definitely be there. The next book I have is actually my first ARC that I've ever read, and I had borrowed this ARC from my local bookstore, but I loved the book so much that when it came out, I decided to purchase it. This is The Night in Question by Susan Fletcher. This is half mystery, half reflective, general fiction type of novel. There's like an 87-year-old lady at an assisted living. She is witness to someone falling and getting very hurt, and she thinks that it was not an accident, that it was in fact maybe murder. And so as she's investigating this murder with a newfound friend at the assisted living, she's also reflecting on her past experiences and how one night in question in her life had impacted the way that she loved and cared for and spent time with the people that she cared about in her life. And so she goes through and thinks about the people that she has loved and the different people she's interacted with in all of her like world travels and experiences and things. And so I really enjoyed this book. I rated it a 4.5 star. It felt really slow, especially at first, like a rambly old lady that has all the time in the world to tell her story. And that was a little hard to get into, but I really enjoyed her perspective. I really love this character. I love learning about her life story. I loved the mystery element. I feel like there were lots of interesting clues and thoughts and things that they investigated. And so it had a more robust mystery than a lot of cozy mysteries that I've read, which I really appreciated. But also had a lot of reflection on her past life, and there were even some parallels between her past and the murder mystery going on. It wasn't super strong. It was pretty subtle, which I feel like was really well done. It made me cry towards the end. It was very heartfelt. It felt very real and meaningful. I really enjoyed this book, and I definitely recommend. This next book is a YA novel, a YA romance called Dungeons and Drama by, what's the name? Christy Boyce. I adored this book. I rated it a 4.5 star. It was so good. I play D&D. I haven't in a while, but I play D&D. And I did musical theater in high school, and I was, in fact, a student director. This book hit home for me. It was just like, I had such a huge connection to it. It was so relatable. Riley is super into musical theater. She's obsessed, and she gets grounded because she does something very unsafe. She drives without a license, like hours away to go see a show. And so she's grounded, and she's sent to her dad's game store in the afternoons to kind of keep her busy and out of trouble, to help him out there. And she meets Nathan, who's a worker there, and all of his D&D buddy friends. And it's really fun to see how like all these friends come together, and her friend group changes, and she just grows in her relationships with all these people. All these characters felt very real and quirky and unique, so it was really fun to read about them. I felt like I was in high school again, but in a good way. I really liked seeing the chemistry between these characters and how their relationship grew. It felt a bit young. These characters I think are like 15, 16. It felt like they were like 15, 16. Definitely on the younger side of YA compared to what I typically like, and so there was some miscommunication and like some assumptions that 15-year-olds make that I didn't really like. But other than that, I adored this book. It was so fun and I loved it. If you like YA romance, then I think you would love this book. Next book I read is a reread, and I don't do a lot of rereads, honestly. This is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I listened to the audiobook and it was a fun time. He is really good at doing different voices, so it was really fun to listen to and forget that there was only one narrator that was narrating the story. If you haven't read Legends and Lattes before, Viv is an orc and she is retiring from being an adventurer, and she wants to open up a coffee house in this city and bring coffee to the people and just enjoy entrepreneurship instead of fighting and hacking down bad guys. She's opening up this coffee house, a bake shop. There's a found family element as people are helping her out and they've got her back. She's hoping to have good fortune in building this business up from the ground. And there's a little bit of an adventuring like side plot of like someone being sneaky, trying to steal her good fortune from her. But overall, this is a really cozy read. If you are a fan of fantasy, of Dungeons and Dragons type of vibe, this fits right in. I rated this a 4.5, better than my first read of this book. I only rated a 4-star before because it felt a little slow. I really enjoyed this, though I do love the prequel even more, Bookshops and Bone Dust, because I felt like the overarching plot in the prequel was more consistent throughout and more meaningful throughout. The stakes were just like a little bit higher, and I really loved the bookshop element more than like a coffee shop. I felt more connected to the bookshop, small town, etc., etc. I love it. Nice and cozy fantasy read if you're looking for that. My final book that I read in April that I want to talk about is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, and this is a 5-star read, another cozy fantasy. It is a low fantasy. There's witches, but there's also regular people too. It's in a real world setting in England somewhere. Mika is a witch. She is unexpectedly tasked with teaching 3 young witches in this house how to be a witch, like how to harness their magic. And that's not something that witches do in this world. They're very solitary because getting all that magic together can lead to some dangerous consequences with like magic going haywire, spells being more powerful than intended, things like that. And so witches stay away from each other is kind of the lore of this book. And so this is a very different experience. It's very cozy, very found family as she's getting to know these 3 sweet girls and helping them come to their own with their magic. And she's getting to know the human adults that are at this house taking care of the property as well. There are some secrets that come forth. This is definitely a romance, a Grumpy Sunshine. She has some past trauma, but she handles it really, really gracefully. And so she's very much the sunshine, but you can see the evidence of how her trauma has shaped her as a person while she is still well adjusted at this point in time. And he is grumpy, but he's got a good heart as he's trying to take care of these girls. So you see that relationship grow, and there's definitely a third act conflict of some secrets that were not shared, some intentions that were not shown. And it was a very believable, very realistic third act conflict, despite, you know, the fantasy of witches. And I really liked how these characters handled that type of conflict and resolved it. It wasn't just all happy dandy fine, but, you know, it took a process to kind of work through that. So a very realistic, very real type of witchy story, found family, wholesome, all good stuff. The next book is coming out really soon. So I'm really excited. I should look up when the sequel is coming out because I want to read that ASAP. 18 books in March and 13 in April. Let's do a really quick rundown of the books that I hope to get to in May. Something that I noticed is that I have a lot of books on my TBR, especially on my physical TBR. I have a couple shelves in my closet that have books and it is overflowing. I can't see my books very well anymore. I really want to read a lot more of the books I have, and I'm reading physical books pretty slowly. So my solution to that is to do some audiobooks for books I've already purchased. So I'm working my way towards doing that so I can get through some of these books a lot faster than I can read them physically, make some room on my TBR shelf. Some books I'm reading currently: The Sock Project by Leigh. This is a sock knitting pattern book. It's got lots of tips and tricks for knitting socks, as well as 25 patterns. Yeah, 25 patterns in here. I'm doing a read along, make along, and I have the Discord link down below if you're interested in joining that little book club as we're sharing the projects that we're working on from here, any fun tips and tricks as we're reading through this book and knitting a pattern by Leigh. So definitely recommend that. I have a ways to go, but now I'm starting to read some of the patterns, and so it's going to be quicker reading to kind of just read the tips in between the actual instructions for the patterns. The pattern I'm making, let me find it. Can I find it? The pattern that I am making for this make along is the Surf Wax socks. They've got a great texture, and this striping at the top is so fun with contrast. So I'm really excited about those. I'm about halfway through my first sock. So making some progress on this. Hoping to finish that sometime in May so that in June we can choose another book, maybe a fun fiction book that has some knitting elements in it. I also started reading The Lives of Saints by Leigh Bardugo since I finished Rule of Wolves. I really want to finish all the Grishaverse books, make sure that I'm totally caught up on Leigh Bardugo's backlog. This contains all sorts of stories and really cool illustrations about different saints mentioned in the Grishaverse. And this is actually one of the longer stories, but most of them are only a couple pages long telling about these saints. So it's a short book. I can read just one or two stories whenever I want, making my way through it, and I'm enjoying it. It's a beautiful book. And this is just like a fun thing to add to the Grishaverse because I enjoy the Grishaverse a lot. So I decided to get it. And this is on my list of 24 physical books that I wanted to read in 2024. So I am almost caught up. I have 7 books read out of 24. And so that's a pace of like 2 books every month. So I'm slightly behind. I should be at 8 books. And so I've got this book that I'm reading right now, help me catch up, and a couple other books I'll talk about soon that I hope to read this month to keep up my quota, averaging 2 books a month from this list. Other books I'm reading, an audiobook. I'm reading Gwenna Lathlin's Mama Cusses. It's a parenting field guide. I love this. Trying not to be the reason your kid needs therapy. I really love Gwenna's YouTube channel. She posts her TikToks on her YouTube as well, and I've really enjoyed her perspective. She's very real. She does indeed swear. She says really silly things. She's very sarcastic, but she's also a very responsive parent, and so I wanted to learn from her perspective and get some ideas on ways that I can maybe work with my 3-year-old a little bit better when emotions are running high on both sides. So I am almost halfway through this book. It's been a really fun audiobook, and I've enjoyed hearing from her actual voice. And I like that this book isn't like chock full of tons of ideas of things to try, but there's enough in there that I'll highlight or underline couple things on the page, just some things that I want to look back on and think more about. But I'm not doing a ton of highlighting and studying and like taking notes. It's not that kind of book. So it's definitely my pace. I don't want to be studying a parenting book at this moment in time in my life. So this is nice for like little bits of wisdom and different things to think about, but not super intense either. Another audiobook I'm reading is How to Solve Your Own Murder by Kristen Perrin. I just barely started that, so I don't have much to say about that, but it's a murder mystery and it's a dual timeline. So you hear about the girl when something mysterious happens in her life after she has already heard from a fortune teller how she will die, with some like mysterious clues. And then fast forward to the present where we just found out that she has died, in fact, and the police have just arrived. So I'm at the very beginning, about 10% in. I've got 2 ebooks going on right now. I am currently reading Queen of Shadows. It's a honker. I am so sad because I love the audiobooks for the Throne of Glass series, but from Queen of Shadows on, these audiobooks are only available through Audible, I think. So I can't get them from my library, which is a bummer. So I'm reading the physical copy, so it's going slowly. I'm actually reading it ebook wise, so I don't have to lug around this big book, and I don't want to like crack my spine, especially because my other books have not had cracked spines, and so I'm trying to take care of my books because I do really like how they look. I am maybe 2/3 of the way through. I still got like 250 pages left to go. It's a big chunk of time still. I've definitely had lots of ups and downs emotionally, so I can only imagine what will happen in the rest of this book, especially because I have 3 books left in the series and they only get longer from here. The other book that I'm reading right now is The Touch of Darkness by Scarlett St. Clair, a dark romance of Hades and Persephone, a retelling from Greek mythology, and they are in the real world where gods are famous. Persephone is trying to be undercover as a mortal. She wants to live a more mortal life, even though she is divine, even though she is a god. I have about 100 pages left. I may finish today because it has been a really fun, quick, and spicy read. Super fast. Books that I'm interested in reading in the month of May. Of course, Funny Story by Emily Henry. I love Emily Henry, like 5 stars all around for her contemporary romances. And I've heard amazing things about Funny Story. I went to the midnight release and I picked up this book and I have not had a chance to read it. I was in the middle of some other romances I wanted to finish, but now that I have cleared my plate a little, I'm really excited to get to reading this. I also feel like I have not read really good mysteries in a while. I just keep getting these cozy mysteries that are not giving me enough mystery substance. I'm not really a thriller suspense person, but I do really like a good mystery, especially with lots of really interesting plot points and clues and things. I'm really hoping that Everyone on This Train is a Suspect by Benjamin Stevenson is going to be a really good book for that. I read his first book, Everyone in My Family Has Killed Someone, and it was hilarious. It was really funny. He's a comedian before he's a writer, and you can tell that in his writing style. So I'm looking forward to what this book will hold. Speaking of trying to get audiobooks for books I have already so that I can clear some things off my physical TBR, I really want to read What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I've had it on my shelf waiting for me, just looking at me for like 2 months now after I read The Fall of the House of Usher, because this book is a retelling of it. I just don't ever want to read this right before bed because I'm worried that it's going to give me nightmares. It's going to be actually scary. I just don't really know what I'm getting into, and I don't want to like sign myself up for that. This feels like a book that I'd want to read like in an afternoon when I have some free time, when it's light outside, just to make sure I'm not going to get super spooked. But I just need to read it because I really want to read the second one too. I really love the first book I read by T. Kingfisher, The House with Good Bones. It was a really good book. I really enjoyed that. So I'm looking forward to this one. It's going to be a quick audiobook listen, so I think I'm just going to try to knock this out and not try to fit it in before bedtime reading because it just might not be a good bedtime read. I've also got a couple other romances. I've realized I have a lot of romances on my shelf that I'm interested in, and I'm pretty particular about which romances I actually buy, but I still have a lot of romances on my shelf because I'm just in more of a lighter reading era because my job is sometimes really emotionally heavy. I have Abby Jimenez's Just for the Summer. I've heard great things about this. It's a little bit of a hefty one. Like probably 400 pages. Yeah, just about 400 pages. But I've heard really good things about it. I've also heard that it's a little bit more emotional. So we'll see how that goes, whether I'm in the mood for that or not. But I would love to read some of her writing. I've heard that people who love Emily Henry tend to love Abby Jimenez. And I have a few of her books that I've been meaning to read, and I just need to do it. Another romance that is kind of out of left field. I've never heard of this author. I hadn't seen this book before, but I ran into it and I was intrigued. This is Till There Was You by Lindsay Hammeroff. And this is about a chef who has a steamy weekend, it says, with a dive bar musician, and she makes him pancakes, and then he makes it big, and he writes a song about her pancakes. And so now she's trying to decide, like, pursuing this relationship or like pursuing career goals of like being a Michelin star restaurant owner. And I don't know why those two things are not able to happen at the same time. I don't know how a relationship with him could jeopardize her career, but I'm hoping to find out. But super, super cute concept, super, super cute cover. I'm really excited to read this because I haven't heard anyone talk about it. And I need to read more books that I don't hear about online that just come from me thinking I'll enjoy it. I talk about that book in my bookshop hop is where I got that. I think I bought this book at Lovebound Library, but I did a bookshop hop and I visited 4 local bookstores in Salt Lake City. I did a little trip around and I purchased this book on that trip. So make sure to check out that vlog if you want to see some local bookstores in Salt Lake City, Utah. Up there and down below. And then, like I said, I have 24 specific books that I want to read on my physical TBR that I'm making a priority to read. And these are a few books on that list that I want to get through in March. So, want to catch up on Lives of Saints. That'll be like a remnant from April. But for May, did I say March? I meant May. But for May, I picked these 2 books. I've got T. Kingfisher's Thorn Hedge. Again, a really short book. It's a fantasy fairy tale retelling is what I've heard. So that should be really fun. It is also self-contained. It's not in a series. So that'll also be good because I don't have to like sign up to read another book if I like reading this book. And there shouldn't be like a huge cliffhanger either. So that should be a really fun read. And then Caraval by Stephanie Garber. I do want to read the Caraval trilogy and the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy I've heard people talking about, but I want to read the Caraval trilogy first because in the timeline of things, this comes first, and I don't really want to spoil anything in the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy, though I've heard it's not like a huge issue, but I want to read things in order if I can, because even though with Shadow and Bones and Six of Crows, I read those series out of order within the Grishaverse, and I kind of wish I'd read them in the right order because I feel like I would have gotten more out of it. So same thing here, hoping to read Caraval. I already have the audiobook on Libby ready to go, so I should get through this pretty quickly. It's in my queue, though. I have quite a few books on loan from the library, so this won't be the book I read tomorrow, but it'll probably be a book I read within a week or so. So excited to read that. And again, I only purchased the first book. I still haven't read the physical copy. I'm just going to do the audiobook and see how I like it. If I really enjoy it, then I'll buy some more of the books so that I have my trophies on my shelf for the books that I absolutely love, that I want to recommend to people. But if not, then I might just only have the first book in the trilogy and do audiobook for the rest. We'll see. Oh my goodness, we are done. This will still be a little bit of a longer video, but considering I talked about 31 books that I had read in the past 2 months, plus another like dozen that I'm either currently reading or hope to read in May, I'm pretty impressed. We got through that pretty quick. I need to rest my voice, take a drink, probably go read a book. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books and if there are any thoughts that you have about them, because I'd love to have more of a discussion with you. And if you've read any of these books that are on my TBR, I would love to hear how you enjoyed them, what you would rate them star-wise. And make sure to follow me on Instagram where I share more about all of my yarny crafts that I do, as well as books that I read and bookish content as well. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you again soon. Until next time, happy reading. Bye! Oh my gosh, I'm too old for this.